Right. So it looks like we're live, and I'm going to be doing my little due diligent tasks. But today's topic is setting up the social context for events. And so that's kind of a craft thing. So yeah, so hopefully we can have fun with this. The first work that comes to mind when I think about setting up social context for events is The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K Le Guin, because she does such an amazing job of setting up the social context of events. And I suppose I should start by saying, okay, why this topic, right? I guess it can come back in some sense to the way that people say, well, there are only X number of stories in the world, or, you know, a lot of different stories have the same kinds of things happening in them. If you were just stripping it down to the what happens level, right? What are the nuts and bolts? Person A, person B, they do this, blah, 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 right? Those kinds of actions, story actions, are often common across different stories. So what makes the stories different? Well, they might turn out differently. The reasons why somebody might do something might be different. How it plays out might be different. What the consequences are might be different. And all of those are the beginnings of the context. But basically, context is what gives meaning to the things that happen, right? And we use our own memories as context to help us understand what's happening to us right now. So when you're in a story and you're writing about something that happens, setting up or seeding the context for those things that are going to happen is really, really important. And everybody does it to some extent. But I think Ursula Le Guin does it brilliantly, and she does it in several ways. Any initial thoughts on this before I start talking about Ursula Le Guin? Okay, so Left Hand of Darkness does a bunch of different stuff. So I guess in some ways there's a show don't tell aspect to this, right? Because you can say, once there were the people of this country and they lived like this, and you know, you can set it up that way. It works, right? But Le Guin is an example of a sort of immersive storytelling style, right? But she also uses several different points of view to set up these contexts, right? So she has the narrative of the experiences of Genli Ai, and then she also has an anthropological perspective on the practices and biology, etc., of the Githenian. And then she also has a folkloric perspective, where she has the folk tales of the people of Gethin. And each of those provides a different kind of context for the events of the main plot. So that makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the events of the main plot, be they whatever they may be, are not going to have the same significance because we get those different perspectives at the beginning. It's kind of like our previous topic that we discussed, which was information management.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's like, where do you put the information?
Yep.
But I suppose a lot of this is, like, you could say, what makes a good twist, right? Well, it's not the twist itself. It's the context for the twist. It's, we've been going along and the evidence was always there, but we never saw it until this moment, right? That's very careful information management. And it's setting up a very specific kind of context for a new type of understanding. I don't particularly want to talk about twists. But I mean, this applies to basically anything. What I'm working on right now, Kimberly knows because I talk to her about it incessantly. But what I'm working on right now is setting up two of my main characters actually encountering each other, right? And when two of my characters encounter each other, the way that those encounters play out has everything to do with who they are, what they know, what their life experiences are like, and how they are expected to react in the situation in which they find themselves. So I have to make sure that there's enough information there that a reader can actually understand what it means for these two characters to be encountering each other, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And it's something I didn't do well in the past. So like, you know, you're like, oh, the person walks in and wow, gosh, I've never seen anybody like this before. That's a tell solution, right? And in an immersive work, or the kind of immersive work that I want to write, it doesn't have the impact that I want it to have, right?
Right.
The person walks in and you just have to kind of take their word for it. Oh, really? Oh, okay. I don't want that to be the case. But when these two characters encounter each other, it's the first time you've seen the second one of them. You've seen one of them before. But so I have to set up the conditions for their meeting across chapters in which at least one of them is not present, and another chapter in which neither of them is present, right? So I have to make sure I'm dropping little breadcrumbs here and there.
It reminds me a little bit of theater where, you know, you come on stage and you know who your character is and you know like their motivations and what they want out of it. But, you know, the other characters on the stage don't necessarily know. And a lot of the times the audience will know, which adds almost a layer of humor.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is the audience contribution, right? Mm-hmm. Again, we bring our social context to the works that we read, which in a way is why it's so important for authors to think about setting up the social context within the story world, because otherwise you're going to get a full-fledged context of interaction that's just going to be imported from whatever the reader thinks this work is most like, right? It's not going to necessarily be our world, but it'll be something. Cliff?
Yeah, hi. Just one of the best scenes in the novel Dune that does all of this really well is the scene where Duke Leto is meeting with Stilgar, the leader of the Fremen, and Stilgar spits at his feet. And all the Duke's men like reach for their weapons because to the Duke and to the reader, this would be an insult. But Duncan Idaho, who has been doing research on Fremen culture, says, no, and then says, thank you for the gift of your water, right? And he spits on the table to give Stilgar the symbolic gift of the water. And so that not only shows the reader the culture, but explains it in a beautiful scene to the reader from the shared perspective that Leto and his men and the reader have at the start of the scene. Right. It's a wonderful moment, and it's a microcosm of everything about the Fremen, right? So that when we see them with their extreme water conservation later in the book, we get it.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting example, because one of the things that it's doing is it's Well, okay. I have often said that I don't think a lot of science fiction takes the importance of manners seriously enough. We often get these things where it's, you know, you have to do these special greetings and you have to make sure you get it right. This happens in Star Trek like often. But it always seems like, oh, these aliens are so quaint and, you know, and particular, aren't they cute, kind of thing. But I think that example from Dune actually takes it and says, here, look, this is what it would be like for us to be offended and what that would mean. We know what spitting means. We don't know what, you know, enunciating this fancy phrase to the alien in this particular way means. But we know what spitting means. And so, yeah, so he's taking advantage of the external context that we share with Leto, and then bringing in the Duncan, Idaho instruction. Outsiders get instruction, which is great. Always a good tool for the writer to set up the contrast. So yeah. Indeed.
Yeah, and in universe, Duncan, Idaho has been embedded with the Fremen and has been learning this. So it makes sense both in universe and to the reader.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask you guys if you've ever done something that required a special social setup. I'm sure you have. I'm thinking, Kimberly, I'm thinking about nucleation specifically. You've got a lot of the corporate rule stuff that you have to set up in order to understand what's going on.
Yeah. The advantage to nucleation, though, is that, you know, not everybody, I suppose, but a great many people have worked in the job with stupid rules. And a great many people have been exposed to the idea of, you know, this is the way we do it, without necessarily understanding why it's done this way or why that's done that way. It's just, here's the rules. So there's, you know, sort of points of control that are familiar to anybody who's had to work with a large group, whether it be if you're in the military, whether it be you worked at a large corporation, whether it be you worked for, you know, a large catering company, right? As things scale, you know, rules and systems come into play. So I didn't go quite as far as bringing in heavy cultural components. There's some of that with one of the characters, but that character got fridged at the very beginning. So we only see the fallout from that. We don't really get into it with any real depth in this particular story. But sort of the systems that everybody has to interact with is where nucleation went with regards to that.
I would say, though, also that you're showing us, so the character of Helen is somebody who has a job that we don't necessarily understand.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
But you set up her context within the corporate structure very well.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
And you also obviously show her doing the job, but I think, in fact, doing the job and showing where she fits into this larger structure and how she interacts with her colleagues, like the fact that everybody's vying for the spot and that kind of stuff, that's something that's really important to understanding her conflicts.
It is. And in the case of the way I've set up this science fictional universe, it's easier to get people to understand Helen in her broader work context than it is to get people to understand what exactly it is that she's doing in her job. Right. There's just what she's doing doesn't really exist yet. And so, asking people to make that cross connection requires a lot of anachronistic, would require a lot of anachronistic language, and I think it would have broken the immersion there. But when in trying to find ways to connect the players to the characters, the work situation and the interactions with colleagues was I think the better way to do it in this particular case.
Mm-hmm. I also, if I can just keep you on the hot seat a little longer, I also count what you did with the psychology of her job as a kind of key piece of cultural context for how she gets treated. Because you wouldn't necessarily think that she would be treated as carefully as she is,
Mm-hmm.
or that she would have to work so hard to have her viewpoint heard.
Mm-hmm.
But you did set up the elements of sort of the psychology of Waldo drivers and the problems that they encounter, when you've been dissociated from your body for a period of time. The difficulty that you might have coming back to it is a really key piece of that.
Yeah. I mean, there's some things that Waldo drivers do that nobody will ever quite get. Right. Because unless you're everybody has has an experience or several experiences that everybody around them just doesn't quite have a parallel for, right? As much as we might try. And so it worked well because I didn't want to make her a lone wolf character, right? There's enough of those out there. And I think this character works better within a system than just, yippee-ki-yay, I'm
but she
right.
Doesn't trust easily though. So she does have, her top person to rely on, which I think is kind of key.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's, I think when we're talking about, things like information delivery and setting things up for your readers, the way those characters interact can be as revealing of the world, right, as doing info dumps, as explaining these two people interact this way because the world is around them. If you can get the interaction right, the world around that interaction explains itself.
Yeah, right? I agree.
Everybody gets the jilted X thing that's going on between Ted and Beauchamp, right? There's everybody's seen that kind of relationship kind of go off the rails. So I don't have to,
at least in narrative form.
Yeah, and I don't have to world build as much. I don't have to say as much. I can show it, and everybody immediately has, oh yeah, there was that time.
Yeah. So I'm gonna poke Lydia and Morgan. Do you guys have anything that you can bring from your own writing and or reading experience that you'd like to add?
Well, mentioning manners, that I like to write things involving the fairies because I really love to do urban fantasy and I love folklore, and there's so much stuff on manners. And I've I wrote that brochure for fairy etiquette just for fun for me to figure out, what are the rules here? Why do they exist? What would be the anthropological basis for being really offended if someone says thank you? And it was really fascinating to think about etiquette as an extension of power dynamics, and seeing what people have already done with positive versus negative face, which I still haven't looked into very thoroughly. But definitely thinking of etiquette as a way of taking or giving power was really informative.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and because in any hierarchy, there's going to be for example, so we might say thank you, and that means I'll remember what you did in terms of where thank comes from. It comes from think. And in another country, you might say like obligado. So I'm obliged to you, basically.
Yeah.
And those would have different meanings for fairies, presumably, because one of them says, I'll remember what you did, which is good, but it's not offering anything. And the other one says, oh, I'm obliged to, I'm in your debt. So that idea of debt was really fascinating and is fascinating as I'm continuing to think about, okay, so how would fairies do it? And then what does that say about what we're already doing, like in the real world? And where does this etiquette that we use every day naturally come from? And what does it mean? How would a fairy court system, like a legal system, not like, fairy courts, kings and queens, how would that work? Are there parallels to our system?
Well, I think you were telling me at one point that there was a contract law aspect to fairy that you were delving into, and I just thought that was really great because we know about these fairy deals, right?
Yeah, and they have a lot of overlap with kind of those demonic deals, right? That idea of signing something away. I've gone ahead and I think probably fairies started out and had a lot of like symbolic resonance with like the dead, but then when Christianity came in, they got kind of encapsulated into that larger canon. So they're kind of thought of as between heaven and hell, the angels who weren't quite bad enough or weren't quite good enough.
Okay.
So, and then also I don't want to go like too deep into my world building because I don't want to monopolize, but
tell us a little bit more.
Yeah. So I was looking at, the different choirs and the breakdown of angels, and I was thinking, where would fairies fit in here? Because there's so many different types. Would they be their own like sub choir? And I think I mentioned to you that I really liked the idea of fairies as like, the civil service or like the legal branch of heaven before the fall. Well, I'm playing with it.
No, I think it's great. I'm just tickled. That's all.
I just thought it would be really funny because there's all of this stuff like don't say thank you, don't give them your name because that could get you into a contract you don't want to be in, and that could totally come from if you put all the lawyers in one place and saw what happened.
See, that's the thing. I agree with you entirely. So fairies are the angels of lawyers. The lawyers of angels, sort of.
Basically, yeah. And it's also really funny because at least, when you're seeing it in movies and stuff, you always have, hopefully you don't have just this, but you always have the fairies as kind of like willowy and ethereal looking versus like angels and demons who've got the muscles. And if like the whole warrior class was excluded, you'd be like, okay, maybe this is how this would end up.
I see.
Yeah. So,
Morgan, do you have something?
Well, there's a thing that I started to play with in terms of greetings, and I like border conditions. And so a young single, unmarried woman from one subculture is meeting a young, unmarried single man from another subculture. And in one culture, they have different customs about who offers a name first and whether or not you ask for a name. And in can't remember exactly which way I put it, but I think she wanted to know his name, and his respect for her meant that he wasn't going to give it to her unless she asked for it. But
she wasn't supposed to ask for it in her culture. Yeah. So so how do you set that up? Do you introduce the concepts before the interaction happens or when it's happening?
I wrote that so long ago I don't exactly remember what I did, but she was also in her culture considered a little bit forward. So I would have to look it up and look at it. But I think what she did was get a little bit exasperated and say, look, we're obviously having a little trouble here because you're a stranger here, and let me tell you how it works here.
Yeah. Which is a perfectly valid way of doing it. Absolutely.
Yeah. But
conflict as a driver for explanation is a wonderful thing.
because the alternative, an alternative that I didn't want to get into is nobody asks for clarification, and so we have these conflicts and antagonistic moment interactions that don't have to happen if you just ask for clarification. And so,
Right.
it might mean that the person, in order to ask for clarification, you have to be already a little outside your own culture's customs,
Right.
and you have to recognize that there are differences between cultures, because if you assume that everybody has the same customs, well, it's like the water and the spit.
Right.
You assume you know what it means, and then you don't learn anything, and you end up with conflict that can be really bad and long lasting, like the first encounter of humans and Minbari.
Okay.
About 5, because one side had one assumption about open gun ports, and the other side had another assumption about open gun ports. And
Okay.
that
Cliff, is there, sorry, Cliff, is there something that you've actually done?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Just that I love that scene in Babylon 5, and that's dramatized very well. And in the beginning, I'm just agreeing with Morgan.
Yeah, no worries. Have you done something in your own writing that you would like to mention?
The prime example I can think about is in the book that I'm currently shopping around trying to get representation for. So I don't really want to talk about it because no one's read
that's
it.
fair.
So
not to worry. So we've had a number of examples of situations where people come into a social situation not knowing what the context is, and then because of that discrepancy or the lack of explanation, tension is created, and then an explanation is required either to move the story on or to diffuse tension in some way, right? So I'd also like to talk about situations where we don't want people to not understand in the moment. And that happens with me a lot in Varin, because the internal points of view that I'm using are insiders, right? And they have a very specific type of understanding of how things work and what things mean. Other people may have a very different view because they have a very different life context. And so I guess this is one of the things about people meeting. But like, for example, the Mbati, the servant caste, have a gesture that invites touch, which is they hold their hand out like this. That is not something that is done by any of the other castes of Varin. So I want to introduce it in a low tension context, in a normal context, so that I can, briefly say, oh, well, she held out her hand to her mom, inviting a touch. Her mom touched her hand, blah, 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 moving on. Right? So that then later when she does that to someone else for whom that would not be a normal thing, I don't have to explain it there. Right? She's basically testing someone to see if they respond. And then they either do or they don't, right? But that other person is not supposed to know, like the Mbati secret handshake, So if readers come into that not understanding what that means, it subtracts from the tension of the situation, right? Because the key is not that one person knows and one person doesn't know. The person who we are visiting the head of actually knows. And so we need to be with them, right? We need to align ourselves with them. And
I remember,
yeah.
I remember that you'd mentioned that idea of creating an arc with like 3 repeating pieces. So basically just giving your reader what they need in order to have that pattern recognition. So that way, when there is a divergence from the pattern, and in this case, a kind of social convention, they'll actually recognize it with the characters. And when I mentioned that to my sister, I think screenwriters have something similar where like something happens 6 times and the character reacts differently, but I haven't looked into that too much yet.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I will just tell you one of the things that I'm setting up, and in a sense, this is this 2 characters meet each other situation. Why is this a big deal? Because in a sense, I'm working against the expectations of readers, not just because they're readers who are not Varin, but also because they've read my previous books. Okay. So if you read book 1, you are accustomed to an internal Embati cast perspective, right? You know what that looks like. There isn't an Embati cast perspective in book 2, but there are a lot of Embati around, and we're hanging out with nobles. And so seeing Embati manservants is pretty normal for a reader, right? So the character that I'm working with right now in chapter 3 of book 3, don't tell anyone, no. This isn't particularly spoilery since it's the very first chapter that we meet this person. Involves a person who has no experience of nobles or of Embati manservants. They have that, this is a guy who's an undercast guy. He has no concept of who these people are. He's, anything he gets about Grobel is going to be completely like 6th hand, right? And it's not relevant to his life at all. And so just having him meet another character who's an Embati manservant has to be utterly shocking, right? And so in order to understand how shocking it is, we have to know what his knowledge of Embati is, right? And our knowledge of what Embati are has to be strong enough that we feel like we know what's going on there, right? And in particular, the only Embati that Corbinin is particularly accustomed to anyone in his life dealing with are the wardens, because some of the Acrobati work in prisons. And so he knows people who work in prison. And so he has a sense of who Embati wardens are, but that's it. So as I set up the Embati in chapter 1, I show the relationship of my character, who is a manservant, to wardens, right? Who are wardens? and how are they related to the people we're familiar with, who are manservants, right? It's a little reminder, oh, by the way, there are these guys, and they are wardens. And they have a tattoo that looks like this, right? And then for chapter 2, you go into a situation where you're with a character who actually works in a prison. And lo, you see Embati, who are wardens and have this tattoo, right? And so you get this, it's a sort of arc of wardenhood, right? Which is very much under the radar. It just kind of has to appear here and there and not necessarily even seem connected to itself. But then when we're visiting Corbinin's perspective in chapter 3, and he's talking about, something has come up about somebody who ran into an Embati and got in trouble because he ran into an Embati. And he's like, ugh, Embati, diamond-faced bastards, right? And in order for that line to make the kind of sense that it needs to make, you have to know who the Embati wardens are, but you also have to know their relationship to the person in chapter 1, because he's about to encounter the person in chapter 1. And it is not going to go well. And when he sees her, he's like, I have never seen this before, and this is very, very, very bad, right? Because this is clearly the Embati that is like way more Embati than any other Embati I have ever seen. So you see my point. It's a fiddly little thing. It's not even a super plot relevant information thread. But nonetheless, I think it's really important because I want my readers to be able to feel alongside my characters, and not just have my characters go, I feel this way, and have somebody listen to them saying that. So, yeah. Anyway, but so it's a very specific kind of little information seeding task. And
Yeah,
I do this stuff constantly. So, sorry, Lydia, go ahead.
well, it sounds like it's, leading up almost like a punchline to finally, or it's pretty funny to be with the character when he's like, those diamond-faced bastards. Like it's
Right.
like it's going to be a lot of
Hopefully.
fun, but only because we have that lead up to that moment.
I think that's one of the things that I love about doing multiple POV, is that you can get humor out of the dramatic irony of knowing exactly what another person would be thinking about those people, and then seeing what this person thinks and having it be very different.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah. Honestly, if I were to get my absolute wish, it would be that people would dig in deep enough to the points of view when they're visiting them, that even when they're not in with that point of view, they can kind of extrapolate how that person is reacting to a scene that it's in someone else's head. So, hopefully it gives a three-dimensional sense to the whole book and not just to a particular chapter. But yeah, social context. The problem is that you can do it with anything, right? You can do it with tiny little things. You have to decide though, whether, I guess this again is the show don't tell kind of thing. You can't show everything. Some things you just should tell and move on, right?
Yeah.
If you're going to make your reader do the work, right, to put this together, there has to be a compelling reason for it. And yeah.
I liked what you said about that idea of kind of knowing the character so well that you have that three dimensions. Definitely in book 1, seeing like a Lauren from Nicantor's perspective is pretty painful.
Yeah.
Because we've been in a Lauren's head, and Nicantor is reading his signals completely wrong. He's thinking, oh, he's so sneaky. And we just know that a Lauren must be just sweating right now.
Right.
Very earnest, very kind of, oh gosh, I'm so sorry. Just because, he's so embodied and he's so private. But, we don't need to know what a Lauren is thinking, even though Nicantor is wrong about what a Lauren is thinking, because we already know him well enough.
Yeah, yeah. Hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a kind of work that I demand from readers. and it's hopefully worth it, right? I mean, the whole idea of having a reader do work is to enhance the experience for them. But there's no denying it is work. So, yeah, it's interesting. I'm trying to think. Let's see, what are some other examples of cultural stuff that gets set up? Well, I mean, there's a million exampments of it. I mean, you can go with anything, including the Prime Directive. The Prime Directive is one of those things that is a thread that threads through the entirety of Star Trek, and I think that's kind of interesting. And our sense of it and the conflicts around it actually grows over time. So I find that to be kind of an interesting. I guess you would almost call it a meta arc across the various series of Star Trek. Is this sort of dialogue between the characters and the Prime Directive. So
the Prime Directive is the one where they're not allowed to talk to alien species until they've warped.
They're
right?
not allowed to sort of interfere in their cultural development, or, you know, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. That was one of the I have issues with the way that was that was put together, right? You know, my otter aliens actually have the sort of opposite of the Prime Directive. Mm-hmm. Their Prime Directive is called purpose, and purpose is art. And so basically they can do almost anything in the service of art. And so, yeah, so what they do is they travel to places simply based on how pretty it's going to look on the map.
Fair enough.
Yeah. And then when they get there and they discover a society, they're like, where are your artists? Here, we will give them technology to make their art cooler. And yeah, and so they are actually, you know, if I ever were to write a novel length piece about them, it would be really fun, because like, I think they go through the universe creating absolute chaos wherever they go.
Create some problems, yeah.
But I mean, they're fun. Can't deny it.
Yeah, they sound like fun. The Prime Directive, they makes some assumptions that the Federation's technology level is a better fit, is superior in every way to the locals' technology, and that's not always the case. To say we will give you technology to make this go faster or farther, or let you feed more people. And if the locals are thinking what we have now works for us and we don't need it to go faster, if we needed it to go faster, we would make it go faster ourselves.
Yeah.
So what exactly is it you think you have to offer us that would make us say anything other than get lost? You're bugging us.
I guess the technology is destabilizing. I guess that would be the idea. Like if you get all of this stuff too fast, or there's that idea of maybe, there'll be some imperialism or accidental.
Oh, yeah, I mean, absolutely. If you really, if there are going to be issues with bringing change happening at a faster pace of any kind. But the Prime Directive makes the assumption that the locals will want that technology.
Yeah.
And that they will accept it, and that they'll demand it, and then they'll misuse it.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting too that the only reason they bring in the Prime Directive 95% of the time is because they're about to break it and then not tell their bosses.
True.
So a plot device for adding tension rather than a serious consideration.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, we
the
morally agonize, right? as we completely screw this up.
unless we're Kirk, and then we don't even do that. So the prime directive, it's important to remember that was invented for the original series from the late 1960s. And the underlying assumption is a colonialist assumption that all societies follow the same trajectory and invent the same things in the same order. And they're just at various levels along that, there are various spots along that progress curve.
Absolutely.
And
that
so
is assumption.
you're right, the prime directive is a pre-warp drive civilization. So once that civilization has invented warp drive, which all civilizations will do when they get to the right point on this curve that every civilization is on, then the prime directive no longer applies. That's the underlying assumption, which is obviously problematic.
Indeed.
But in the 1960s, it was considered less problematic and easy to explain to viewers. But, you know,
I think
basically,
it's a familiar narrative, right?
Yeah, I mean, basically, don't interfere with them primitives, right? I mean, that's
100%. Which
it.
Is a thing that has occurred in a lot of literature and a lot of contexts. So I'm sure people found it very familiar.
And Ian M. Banks deliberately turned it on its head with the culture novels, where all of the stories about the culture are pretty much about the special circumstances division that deals with special circumstances, and often they're the cultures that are, you know, faster than light, pre-FTL, and the culture justifies its existence as a civilization because it uplifts those poor benighted pre-FTL cultures into the enlightened culture of the culture and absorbs them. That's its thing. So it does the opposite of the Federation. And part of my understanding is that part of the reason he set it up that way was just to, like, basically reverse Star Trek.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
But also because it made for good plotting, right? Good plots. But the culture, he implies strongly that the culture would be kind of lost, like at sea, adrift, not knowing what to do with itself if it didn't uplift civilizations into itself.
Well, you know, that makes me think of the Anne Lecky's Radkai Empire, and how once you've become a citizen of the empire, then you are by definition civilized. And it's fascinating to see works that actually play with those questions and start to kind of dig into colonialist assumptions. And I think, in fact, that takes a lot of setup, right? You have to set your parameters very deliberately, and you know, so it can be some explanation, it can be some setting up a scene that demonstrates a particular type of interaction. I think Anne Leckie is very does explain it, but I think the way that she chooses to do it is very interesting, because she has Breck explaining it, and Breck disapproves so deeply that you get these explanations that are incredibly ironic in tone, and like, oh yeah, because you know, by definition they're civilized now, you know, and I think that works really, really well. It's really fascinating.
So one example of deconstructing that, I did, and you heard me read it once, I did a Martian steampunk story where the Victorians have settled Mars, and it's kind of like the Raj. That's how they're treating it. And so, you know, Martians are second-class citizens and so forth. And there's the capital of New London, and they're not allowed to live in the capital, right? Even though it's their planet, they have to live outside. So that is, you know, and the narrator buys into all the colonialist assumptions, but the reader is hopefully meant to understand that the narrator has a blind spot. I mean, that's not the point of the story, but that's embedded I embedded that in the story. And then Chaz Brenchley has been doing a series of Martian steampunk stories and books that do a similar thing, by deconstructing Victorian colonialist mindset. And so there's this friction between the reader's understanding of colonialism and the character's understanding of colonialism, because they are embedded in their own worldview. So he takes advantage of the difference between and that's, instead of taking advantage of the similarity between the reader's worldview and the character's worldview, he takes advantage of the difference.
Yep. Well, it's really interesting because we've all, I was remarking on how deeply we've internalized a lot of the narratives of the British Empire. That it has had a huge influence on storytelling, for sure, and not just on steampunk, but on other things as well. In any case, it is now 5 o'clock. Time flies when the topic is fun. So I want to thank you all for coming and chatting with me today. I think we talked about some interesting stuff, and I really enjoyed it. So we will most likely meet again next week. I am sort of doing topics on the fly at the moment, but I know that we're going to have more guests soon, because I know Marie Brennan wants to come and talk about another book, so that should be fun. I also, if you please feel free, if you're watching, or anyone here, if you have an idea of somebody who you would like me to interview, please feel free to let me know, and I will reach out and see if they would like to come on the show and talk about their work, because I really enjoy learning about people's world building and all of the things that they are creating. It's really super fun. So for now, what I'm going to do